Donald Trump seems to be pretty desperate to strike up a trade deal with China. I think to outsiders, it does look like he is caved in on a very, very important matter, a huge strategic error. They do have very strong leverage over the United States. The Chinese have got the Americans over a barrel, so to speak.
A trade truce between the United States and China is due to end in a few days' time. So what happens next? Let's talk about it with George Magnus, Research Associate at Oxford University's China Centre and the author of Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. George, thank you so much for joining us again. Now, if we look at the trade deals the US has made so far, whether with the EU or Japan, the perception seems to be that America holds the cards. Where does the balance of power lie with China?
I think it's quite complicated, certainly with regards to the EU and Japan and South Korea and so on. I mean, it looks like the United States holds the cards. In practice, in fact, I think those allies actually also have probably weighed decisions about whether it makes sense for them to do this kind of deal. But leaving that aside and moving, as you asked, to the China part of this, I think, Donald Trump seems to be pretty desperate to strike up a what we call a kind of a phase one type trade deal, which is similar to the deal that he negotiated with Xi Jinping back in 2017, which is really an undertaking on the part of the Chinese to buy more American products. I mean, he's pretty desperate to have that happen. He seems to be going out of his way to, meet Xi Jinping somewhere, perhaps at the APEC summit later this year. Lots of things have happened in Washington which seem to suggest that he's kind of been soft, been giving in to Chinese demands on export controls, particularly for NVIDIA's very high-end H20 chip, so-called, and a few other things as well. So the impression we get certainly is that Trump's leverage with China is much less.
I want to touch on something you just mentioned, because that phase one of a trade deal already happened in Trump's first term, and it seems it was never enforced. Am I right in that perception?
Well, the Chinese never lived up to their commitments to purchase the products that they promised they would. And in fact, the shelf life of that deal was pretty short. I suspect the shelf life of another type of deal like this will also be pretty short, since there aren't really any mechanisms that work or that both sides respect for policing it and enforcing it. But it seems to be quite important to the US administration to be able to trumpet the notion that there has been, will have been a trade deal with China, that Trump will want to boast that only he could have brought this about. Of course, there's also stuff going on in the background, right? Because one of the reasons that the Americans basically kind of balked a little bit at the 145% tariffs that were announced earlier this year is because of the Chinese decision to counter America's aggression, as they saw it in trade, by restricting or withholding shipments of rare earths, to which American car companies and other high-tech companies lobbied the administration and said, we can't really function unless we have access to these metals. So that's really the product of an oversight and a kind of a huge strategic error that not just the Americans, but the Europeans as well, have made over the last 10 or 15 years by effectively outsourcing the processing of these rare earths to China, for now at least.
To what extent would you say that particular move, that decision to restrict the export of these critical elements and magnets, set the tone for trade negotiations?
Yeah, I think it was quite important, really. I mean, it was certainly from a negotiating standpoint. I mean, China had every right and every interest to do that because it's an area where they do have very strong leverage over the United States and over other countries. They tried the same thing with Japan about something like 10, 12, 15 years ago, which the Japanese actually took it very, very seriously and proceeded to develop a more diversified access to these metals. And I don't think they're in the same position today that they were in then. But you can't really fix these things overnight, and the United States is clearly not in a position of being able to solve it in a matter of weeks or months. One gets the impression, certainly, that in this particular regard, that the Chinese have got the Americans over a barrel, so to speak.
You also mentioned that the US walked back on its own restrictions on chip exports, allowing NVIDIA to send this H20 chip to China. Some people describe that as a strategic error. How would you assess that decision?
Yeah, it's not something. I'm not obviously in a position of advising the American government, but I think if I were, and if I think lots of people that I know who have commented on this, who are much more knowledgeable about it than I am, if they were, I think their advice would be to, they shouldn't have done it. That it's basically giving away a crown jewel, but it's obviously kind of fallen into the scope of negotiations between the US and China because Washington seems to want to go quite a long way to try to get this type of trade arrangement with Xi Jinping for whatever reason, or for reasons that Trump probably knows best. But I think to outsiders it does look like he is caved in on a very, very important and strategic matter. I suspect in good time that actually, this will all be unraveling. But for now, I think that is the case.
I want to look more closely at this trading relationship. The US is China's most important export market, but the share of its exports going to the US has actually fallen in recent years, making up around 14% last year. Do you see this trend continuing in spite of Washington's crackdown on transshipping?
I think it could well continue, yes, because, of course, as you rightly say, that the reason that China's share of imports into the United States has dropped so markedly, is reflected in the fact that the shares of other countries like Mexico, Thailand, Vietnam, India, has gone up because of the transshipment. And there are lots of different ways in which the Chinese firms and Chinese producers can get around these tariffs. Obviously, they can shift their production lock, stock and barrel to third countries, and then they can stamp their products, made in Vietnam or made in Mexico, bona fide. Or there are other ways of doing it. They're not legal necessarily or recognized by the WTO, but you can effectively, ship products into, a foreign port, rebrand them, and effectively, get them re-exported. This is a very, very kind of common practice now, and I think it's probably going to get more common because it's quite difficult to police and quite difficult to control. So I don't think we should be put off or be distracted by just the straight bilateral trade contraction between China and the United States. It's just that the trade is taking place, but in a different way.
You mentioned the World Trade Organization there and the question of enforcement. What kind of role do you see for multilateral institutions in the future, given their declining relevance?
Well, in practice, none, because in the WTO's decision-making capacity has effectively been undermined by, the proximate reason why it's been undermined is because of America's refusal to sanction, the appointment of judges for dispute settlement. But anyway, I think that, the sort of respect or the kind of regard which the WTO is held in nowadays is obviously much less than it used to be. And, the Americans are not completely without cause in complaining that the that China's basically taken advantage of the WTO. And so there are kind of bona fide reasons why, maybe the WTO is not best suited to be able to, address some of the functions or the malfunction that we've got in the global trading system. In fact, I mean, discussing this with, lots of people nowadays, I think the IMF actually is much better positioned to be able to draw up new rules for trade, but that would require a lot of cooperation and collaboration between the Americans and the Chinese, the Europeans, and lots of others. And that the basis for that collaboration may not actually be there, unfortunately.
Why is the IMF in a better position? Is it just because of the way it's structured as opposed to the WTO?
Because I think the argument in the WTO, I mean, the WTO basically polices the accepted rules of international trade and commerce. And the IMF is supposed to have a much deeper and broader macroeconomic role in determining the justification and basis for the countries running surpluses, deficits, imposing capital controls, trade controls, and so on. So, I mean, the World Trade Organization can call foul if somebody does something that it goes against the rules and somebody else brings a complaint. The WTO can hear that complaint and make a judgment. But actually, the problem that we have really isn't necessarily with the rules of international trade. It's specifically, i.e. tariffs and quotas and so on. But it actually is with a lot of controls and what we call behind the border measures, which are industrial policies, subsidies, procurement, below market borrowing programs, the kinds of things that don't really make the headlines of news and so on because they're hidden and because they're domestic policy, ostensibly domestic policy, but they result in the creation of these big surpluses and deficits, which are the primary cause of trade and commercial conflict between, ostensibly between the US and China, but between lots of other countries as well.
Yeah, because I remember in Trump's first term, there was a lot of talk about what would be in phase 2 of a trade deal. And this never happened, but the chat then was that it would be all about intellectual property and overcapacity. Do you see these issues being tackled in further negotiations between the two countries?
Yeah, I don't think overcapacity will form part of the negotiations, although I could imagine that the Americans would like to make it part of that discussion. And it's a much bigger problem now than it was in 2017, 2018, because obviously it's not just about electric vehicles and batteries, which everybody reads about or hears about all the time, but it applies in steel, glass, cement, chemicals, and in the domestic economy of China, in the housing industry, infrastructure, solar equipment, wind turbines, almost everything, because it's part of China's industrial policy to actually focus on producing and production and supply. And they don't have bankruptcy laws where weak firms, not like we do, where there's a discipline for weak firms to go out of business or to account for losses and so on. So it is a big, big issue. But and it ought to be addressed in the context of international negotiations, because it's not just the United States that has kind of a problem with this. But I don't really see where those discussions would take place. They're not really. They might take place in the context of the WTO, but I think the WTO is, as we've discussed, rather emaciated compared with what it was once. And I think there has to be a bona fide reason or justification or willingness on the part of Beijing to be able or to want to be able to talk about it and to show willing to curb it, which I don't think they're really willing to do.
Whatever you think of this model, is it even sustainable? Because if I understand you right, at the moment we have the situation where Chinese consumers have way too many products they don't want to buy. They don't have the money to buy all these electric vehicles. There's an oversupply of housing. There is infrastructure that's being underused. I mean, the money for all of these things has to come from somewhere. Do you see this sustaining itself over time, or do you think there's some sort of collapse coming?
Well, I mean, a Leninist-based economy has all sorts of tools and controls available to it to be able to what we used to say in the financial crisis in 2008, extend and pretend. You just kind of push the problem out into the next 2, 3, 5 years and pretend that it's not an issue now. I mean, banks did that all the time until obviously the regulations were tightened up. But national governments can do that almost with impunity. And so I mean, the pressure is certainly there. I think that Chinese policymakers, many of them, and certainly many Chinese economists at think tanks, for example, I think they're well aware that the industrial policy export model which China is pursuing is leading it down a very kind of rocky path, and that the model needs to change towards one which emphasizes consumption and imports more. And if it did that, I'm pretty sure that a lot of the problems in international trade, not all of them, but a lot of them would actually diminish. But for the Chinese government to do that and to bite the bullet on that kind of huge shift in the economic model, you're basically asking it to go against the kind of the fundamental political principles according to which it rules, which is to stay in power and to restrict the distribution of power to anybody else. If you want a more kind of consumer-oriented or Western style of economy, you basically carving out kind of different niches of economic and political power, which the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has no interest in sharing. It's a big problem.
These very policies you mention have been encouraging other countries to try to de-risk their relationships with Beijing. But now Trump's tariff war has made ties with the US seem just as precarious in a way. How is this tariff war shaping how the rest of the world views China?
Well, there was, in the early days of Trump's kind of tariff campaign during the early spring and late spring, there was a lot of sentiment around that, we have to, de-risk ourselves actually from the United States, which has become an unreliable ally. And, we don't really know, we don't really want to pay Trump's tariffs. And, there were lots of excuses being made that people should diversify their trade away from the United States and towards China. I mean, certainly in the United Kingdom, I don't think it's going to happen, but I mean, there were certainly people in the government that were kind of speaking along those lines. And of course, it's nonsense because the Chinese market, I mean, although the Chinese have very, very high levels of imports because, it's a $20 trillion economy, but the growth of imports in China in the last 5 years has been pretty much zero. China's model is really all about exporting products to people, not importing them. So the idea that, the EU or Britain or Korea or Japan, Brazil, India, and so on, that countries would find new export markets in China as a substitute for the United States was always a fantasy, and it is a fantasy. So I think that there's been a kind of reluctant, biting of the bottom lip on the part of, US allies and countries that are essentially aligned with, let's say, Western commerce and Western trade. That they've basically agreed reluctantly to say, well, if we can get 10, 15%, even 20% tariffs, with the United States, we don't like it, but we can live with it. And we don't really want to get into a kind of a bidding war with Trump, where if we retaliate, he'll just uber retaliate, to the point where relations will be severely compromised or break down. So, yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a bit of a a kind of reconciliation, shall we say, with the kind of original view. And many countries, not all of the ones that Trump boasted about, but many countries have reached trade agreements with the US in which they've agreed higher tariffs, but not necessarily crippling. I imagine they will adapt, and I think that's the reality. I mean, they've agreed to do it, but through gritted teeth.
You've mentioned China's reliance on exports, but one thing it has been importing is Russian energy. Why has it not been getting the same flack as India for doing that?
That's a good question. And I think the answer is because Trump has, or the US administration has no chance of being able to persuade China to do, well, many things actually, and one of the things that it can't persuade Beijing to do is to change its policy towards Russia, including China's imports of fossil fuels, including oil and coal and so on. Whereas it thinks, I mean, the American administration thinks it has leverage over India and can persuade India to cut its. At least, I mean, some of that oil that it's getting from Russia isn't all about consumption in India. A lot of it is, but a lot of it is also transshipping Russian oil to third countries. So I imagine, I don't really know the details, none of us do at this stage, that the pressure on the Indian government from the United States has been to try to curtail fossil fuel imports from Russia. But, the Americans probably feel they have a chance of being able to do that, whereas I think they have zero chance of being able to persuade Chinese to do that.
George Magnus, we could talk about this all day, but very sadly, I have to leave it there. Thank you so much.